Daniel Harper discovered the truth about his wife. He wished he'd never looked. For 3 weeks, Rebecca had been disappearing into their garden every night at exactly 11:47 p.m. Daniel would lie awake in their bed, listening to the soft click of the back door, the whisper of her footsteps on the patio stones, and then silence. She'd return an hour later, sometimes 2, with dirt under her fingernails and a look in her eyes that made his stomach turn. When he asked her about it, she'd smile that same warm smile he'd fallen in love with 7 years ago and say, "Just gardening, honey. Helps me sleep." But Daniel knew his wife. And the woman disappearing into that garden every night wasn't her. It started 3 weeks earlier, on a Tuesday. Daniel remembered because Tuesdays were their date nights, a tradition they'd maintained since their 2nd year of marriage. That particular Tuesday, Rebecca had canceled. "I'm just so tired, Dan," she'd said, her hand trembling slightly as she poured her coffee. "Can we rain check?" He'd noticed the trembling, the dark circles, the way she'd been checking her phone obsessively, then quickly putting it face down whenever he entered the room. At first, Daniel thought what any husband might think. An affair? The thought made him sick, but he couldn't shake it. The late-night walks. The distance. The way she'd stopped meeting his eyes when they talked. But then came that first night. Daniel had pretended to be asleep, watching through barely open eyes as Rebecca slipped out of bed. She'd moved carefully, deliberately, like she'd done this 100 times before. He'd waited 5 minutes before following. The back door stood open, the cool October air drifting into their kitchen. Through the window, he could see her, standing in the middle of their garden, completely still, staring at the ground. For 20 minutes, she didn't move. Daniel's heart pounded as he watched her. This wasn't an affair. This was something else. Something wrong. When she finally returned to bed, Daniel pretended to be asleep. She slid in beside him, and he could feel her trembling. "Rebecca," he whispered. "I'm fine," she said quickly. "Go back to sleep." The next morning, Daniel went into the garden. Everything looked normal. Roses, tomato plants, the small herb garden Rebecca had planted in spring. Nothing unusual. Nothing that would explain why his wife was standing there in the middle of the night like a ghost. But then he saw it. In the far corner, near the fence, the soil had been disturbed. Not like normal gardening. This was different. Deliberate. Like something had been buried. Or dug up. Daniel's mouth went dry. That day at work, Daniel couldn't focus. His mind kept circling back to that patch of disturbed soil, to Rebecca's hollow eyes, to the trembling in her hands. He pulled out his phone and texted her. "How are you feeling today?" The response came immediately. "Better. Love you." But something about it felt rehearsed, automatic. That evening, Rebecca seemed almost normal. She made dinner, chicken parmesan, his favorite, and they watched TV together. She even laughed at a joke in the show they were watching. But when 11:47 approached, Daniel saw the change. She became distant, her eyes focusing on something he couldn't see. Her hands started trembling again. "I'm going to step outside for a bit," she said softly. "It's almost midnight," Daniel said, trying to keep his voice casual. "What are you doing out there, Beck?" She looked at him then, and for just a moment he saw something in her eyes. Fear? Desperation? "I have to," she whispered. That night, Daniel didn't just watch from the window. He followed her into the garden. Rebecca stood in the exact same spot as before, staring down at the disturbed soil. But this time, she was whispering. Daniel crept closer, hiding behind the old oak tree, straining to hear. "I'm sorry," Rebecca was saying, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to. I didn't mean to." Over and over. Like a prayer. Like a confession. Then she dropped to her knees and started digging with her bare hands. Daniel's blood ran cold. He wanted to rush to her, to pull her up, to demand answers, but something stopped him. Some instinct told him that interrupting her would be dangerous. So he watched. She dug for 15 minutes, her hands deep inside the sand, until she'd created a hole about 2 feet deep. Then she stopped. She reached into her pocket and pulled out something small. In the moonlight, Daniel couldn't make out what it was. She placed it carefully in the hole, then began covering it up, smoothing the soil with shaking hands. When she was done, she sat back and sobbed. Great, heaving sobs that shook her entire body. Daniel couldn't take it anymore. "Rebecca!" She screamed, actually screamed, and scrambled backward, her eyes wild with terror. "Daniel! What are you? You can't be here. You can't." "What are you doing?" he demanded, moving toward her. "What did you just bury?" "Nothing. It's nothing. Please, just go back inside." But Daniel was already at the hole, already dropping to his knees, already digging. "Daniel, no. Please!" she screamed. His fingers hit something solid, small, wrapped in cloth. He pulled it out. It was a prescription pill bottle, wrapped carefully in a handkerchief. The label had been torn off. Daniel looked up at his wife, confusion and fear warring in his chest. "What is this?" Rebecca's face crumbled. "They were Mom's," she whispered. Inside, under the harsh living room lights, Rebecca finally told him everything. Her mother had died 6 months ago from the brutal pancreatic cancer. Daniel knew this. Of course. He'd been there for the funeral, held Rebecca through the worst of her grief. What he hadn't known was what happened the day before her mother died. "She was in so much pain," Rebecca said, her voice barely audible. "The doctors said it would be hours, maybe days. But she was suffering, really suffering." Daniel felt something cold settling in his stomach. "She begged me," Rebecca continued, tears streaming down her face. "She begged me to help her. Said she couldn't take another minute of it." She continued. "I was her nurse," Rebecca said, her voice breaking. "Before I quit to stay home, I was her nurse. I knew which medications could. I knew what would be painless." The room seemed to tilt around Daniel. "You didn't," he whispered. "She was my mother," Rebecca sobbed. "She was dying anyway. In hours, the doctors said. Maybe less. And she was in agony. I gave her extra morphine. More than I should have. Enough to let her sleep. To let her slip away peacefully." Daniel couldn't speak. Couldn't move. The nurses found her 20 minutes later. They ruled it natural causes as she was already dying, but I knew. I knew what I'd done. She looked at Daniel with hollow, desperate eyes. "I kept the pills. The bottle I used. I couldn't throw them away. Couldn't risk anyone finding them in the trash. So I kept them hidden, and every night I'd take them out and just stare at them, wondering if I was a murderer. Wondering if I'd made the right choice or if I was just a coward who killed her own mother. 3 weeks ago, I couldn't take it anymore. The guilt was eating me alive. So I decided to bury them. To literally bury the evidence, bury the guilt. But then I'd lie in bed thinking about them out there in the dirt, and I'd panic. What if someone found them? What if a dog dug them up? What if... Her voice broke entirely. So I'd dig them up. And then the next night, I'd bury them again. Over and over. I can't stop, Dan. I just can't." Daniel didn't sleep that night. He'd held Rebecca while she cried herself into an exhausted sleep, but his mind was racing. His wife had euthanized her own mother. The words sounded insane and literally impossible. But he'd seen her pain. Her mother's pain. He remembered visiting the hospital that last week, seeing the agony etched into the dying woman's face. What would he have done in Rebecca's position? He honestly didn't know. The next day, Daniel called in sick to work. He made an appointment with Dr. Raymond Cole, a psychiatrist that Maggie, Rebecca's best friend, had recommended months ago during the worst of Rebecca's grief. Rebecca hadn't wanted to go then. Now she had no choice. Dr. Cole listened quietly as Rebecca told her story, all of it. The pain, the decision, the guilt, the compulsive burial and reburial of the pills. When she finished, he was quiet for a brief moment. "Rebecca," he finally said, his voice gentle, "what you're describing is complicated grief mixed with intrusive thoughts and compulsive behaviors. Classic PTSD symptoms." "But what I did," Rebecca started. "What you did," Dr. Cole interrupted gently, "was watch your mother suffer unbearably and try to ease that suffering. Whether it was right or wrong isn't my place to judge. But what is my place is to tell you that the guilt and trauma you're experiencing is destroying you. And that can be treated." Dr. Cole prescribed medication for anxiety and started Rebecca on intensive therapy. Twice a week, sometimes more when the intrusive thoughts became overwhelming. He also said something that stayed with Daniel. "In the medical community, there's a reason we have such deep debates about end-of-life care and physician-assisted death. Because these decisions aren't black and white. They exist in the gray spaces where love and mercy and ethics collide." A week later, Rebecca told Maggie everything. Daniel had been worried about how Rebecca's best friend would react, worried she'd be horrified, worried she'd report Rebecca, worried everything would fall apart. But Maggie listened quietly, then reached across the table and took Rebecca's hand. "My grandmother had dementia," Maggie said softly. At the end, she didn't know who anyone was. She was scared all the time, confused. The doctors said she could live like that for years. She died in her sleep about 6 months after her diagnosis. "Heart attack," they said. But I found an empty pill bottle in my dad's things when we were cleaning out her house. He never said anything. No one said anything. But I knew. Rebecca's eyes widened. "I'm not saying what you did was right or wrong," Maggie continued. "I'm saying you're not alone. I'm saying these impossible choices happen every day, in hospital rooms and nursing homes, and the people who make them carry that weight forever. But they're not monsters. They're just people who loved someone and tried to ease their pain." For the first time in weeks, Daniel saw something in Rebecca's eyes besides guilt and fear. He saw the beginning of acceptance. 2 weeks later, Rebecca's brother Thomas showed up unannounced. Thomas Crane was everything Daniel wasn't: confident, wealthy, successful. He ran a real estate development company worth millions and lived in a penthouse downtown. He'd also been their mother's executor and power of attorney. "Rebecca, we need to talk," Thomas said without preamble, brushing past Daniel into the house. Rebecca's face went white. "What about?" she asked, her voice shaky. Thomas pulled out his phone and pulled up an email. "The hospital sent me the final billing and medical records for Mom's estate. I need you to look at something." Daniel's blood ran cold. "There's a notation here," Thomas said, his voice hard, "about irregular morphine administration in Mom's final hours. They flagged it for review but ultimately didn't pursue it because she was terminal anyway." Rebecca swayed on her feet. Daniel caught her arm. "But I pursued it," Thomas continued. "I called the hospital, asked questions. And do you know what the head nurse told me?" "Silence. She told me you were in the room alone with Mom for about 30 minutes before she died. She told me you insisted on administering the morphine yourself, said you wanted that private moment with her." "Thomas," Rebecca started, "did you kill our mother?" Thomas asked flatly. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Daniel stepped forward, anger surging through him. "Your sister was trying to help." "I'm not talking to you," Thomas snapped. "Rebecca, answer the question." Rebecca looked at her brother, this man she'd grown up with, played with, confided in, and Daniel could see her crumbling. "She was suffering," Rebecca whispered. "She begged me." "So you did it," Thomas said. "You actually did it." "She had hours left." Rebecca cried. "Maybe days." "And every single second was agony." "You weren't there, Thomas. You were at some conference in Seattle. You didn't hear her screaming. You didn't see her." "So you decided to play God," Thomas said coldly. "I decided to be merciful." Rebecca shouted. Daniel had never heard her sound like that, desperate and fierce and broken all at once. The room went silent. Then Thomas did something unexpected. He sat down. "Do you know why I was at that conference?" he asked quietly. Rebecca stared at him. "Because I couldn't watch her die," Thomas said, his voice breaking. "Because I'm a coward. Because I couldn't handle seeing Mom like that, in pain, wasting away. So I ran. I hid behind work and told myself I'd be there at the end, but I made sure I wasn't." He looked up at his sister, and there were tears in his eyes. "And you were brave enough to stay. Brave enough to hold her hand. Brave enough to do what I couldn't." "I'm not going to report you," Thomas said. "The hospital isn't pursuing it. Legally you're clear. But Rebecca—" He stood and crossed to her, pulling her into a fierce hug. "You have to let this go. You have to forgive yourself. Because Mom would never, ever want you destroying yourself over this." Rebecca collapsed against her brother, sobbing. Daniel watched them, his own eyes burning with tears. That night, Daniel and Rebecca went into the garden together. They dug up the pill bottle one last time. "We could destroy it," Daniel suggested. "Throw it away where no one will find it." But Rebecca shook her head. "No," she said softly. "I need to do something else." The next day, they drove to the cemetery where Rebecca's mother was buried. Rebecca carried the pill bottle in her pocket. They stood at the grave for a long time, not speaking. Then Rebecca knelt down and began to dig, not in the grave itself, but in the soft earth beside it, near the flowers. She buried the pill bottle there. "I'm putting it with you, Mom," she whispered. "Where it belongs. Where I don't have to carry it anymore." She stood, and Daniel pulled her close. "It's over," he said softly. "It's over," she repeated. And for the first time in months, Daniel felt like she meant it. 3 months later, things were different. Rebecca was still in therapy, still working through the trauma and grief. But the midnight walks had stopped. The hollow look in her eyes had faded. She'd started volunteering at a hospice center, helping families navigate those final, impossible days with their loved ones. "I can't change what I did," she told Daniel one morning. "But I can help other people facing the same impossible choices. I can let them know they're not alone." Daniel had also changed. He'd learned that the world wasn't black and white, that people he loved could make choices he'd never have imagined, that right and wrong sometimes existed in spaces too gray to define, and that loving someone meant standing beside them in those gray spaces. On a cool evening in January, nearly 6 months after everything began, Daniel and Rebecca were in the garden together. Not digging up guilt, just planting flowers. "Do you think I'm a bad person?" Rebecca asked suddenly. Daniel looked at his wife, this woman who'd carried such impossible weight, who'd made such an unbearable choice out of love and mercy. "I think you're human," he said. "I think you did something impossible in an impossible situation. I think you'll carry it forever. But no, Beck, I don't think you're bad." She leaned against him, and they watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold. "I loved her," Rebecca whispered. "I know," Daniel said. "And I'd do it again." Daniel closed his eyes. "I know," he said again. Because he did. And maybe that was enough. In the end, Daniel learned something that would stay with him forever. Love isn't always beautiful. Sometimes it's carrying impossible burdens. Sometimes it's making choices that haunt you. Sometimes it's watching someone you love destroy themselves with guilt and choosing to stand beside them anyway. The question of whether Rebecca did the right thing wasn't one Daniel could answer. Maybe there was no right answer. Maybe there was only love, messy, complicated, heartbreaking love, and people doing their best with impossible choices. What Daniel knew for certain was this: his wife had watched her mother suffer unbearably and tried to ease that suffering. She'd carried that choice like a stone in her chest for months. She'd nearly destroyed herself with guilt. But she'd also survived. They'd survived. And every night, when 11:47 p.m. came and went, Rebecca stayed in bed beside him, not digging up the past, just sleeping. Finally, sleeping peacefully.